Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that rarely appears in the sagas or epic tales, the long, cold, impossibly dark months of the Viking winter. Not the raids, not the battles, not the voyages across angry seas. Just the waiting, the enduring, the slow, grinding passage of time when the world outside turned hostile and survival meant sitting still. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When most people think of Vikings, they imagine dragon-headed longships cutting through waves, warriors with axes charging into battle, traders haggling in distant markets from Constantinople to North America. The popular imagination sees Vikings as perpetual motion, restless wanderers who couldn't sit still, who lived for adventure and died gloriously in combat. And yes, that happened. The raids were real, the voyages were extraordinary, the conquests reshaped medieval Europe. But here's what the sagas don't spend much time on, what Hollywood consistently ignores, what gets left out of nearly every dramatic retelling. For half the year, sometimes more, Vikings couldn't do any of that. They couldn't raid, they couldn't sail, they couldn't travel far from home. The sea froze, the rivers turned to ice, snow buried the landscape, daylight shrank to just a few precious hours, and in the far north disappeared entirely for weeks. Winter in Scandinavia wasn't just cold, it was hostile, isolating, and profoundly boring. From roughly October to April, depending on the region and the severity of the season, Viking communities essentially shut down. Ships were pulled ashore, covered, and left to weather the storms. Tools were stored. Livestock were brought close to the homestead, and families retreated indoors into longhouses that were dark, smoky, crowded, and filled with the smell of unwashed bodies, animals, and slowly fermenting food. There they waited, for months, with nothing to do but survive until spring returned and life could resume. This is the story of how Vikings spent those long winter months. Not the dramatic parts, the quiet parts, the tedious, repetitive, occasionally desperate reality of enduring a Scandinavian winter with medieval technology and no modern comforts. No electric lights, no central heating, no grocery stores stocked with fresh produce, no entertainment beyond what you could create yourself. Just you, your family, your neighbors, the livestock, and the long, dark nights that seemed to stretch on forever. Winter shaped Viking life in ways that raiding never could. It dictated when you could travel and when you had to stay home. It determined what you ate, how you lived, even how you thought about time and survival. The Vikings who sailed to England, who founded Dublin, who reached North America, who terrorized the coasts of Europe, those same people spent half their lives doing something far less glamorous. They sat, they waited, they told stories to pass the time, they repaired tools, they spun wool, they fed animals, they argued with family members they couldn't escape. They went slightly mad from cabin fever, and they did it all again the next winter, and the winter after that, year after year, generation after generation. The summer raids, the legendary voyages, those were brief interruptions in a life defined by seasonal rhythms and the overwhelming need to prepare for winter. Everything Vikings did during the warmer months, farming, fishing, trading, even raiding, was ultimately in service of surviving the next winter. The entire culture was structured around the inescapable reality that for half the year, the world became a frozen, dark, dangerous place where survival required careful planning, communal cooperation, and sheer stubborn endurance. So tonight, we're not talking about Ragnar Lothbrok or Harald Hardrada. We're not discussing the great heathen army or the founding of the Danelaw. We're talking about the part of Viking life that was, frankly, deeply boring, the part where nothing happened, the part where time moved slowly and survival meant sitting still, the part where the greatest enemy wasn't an English king or a rival jarl, but the cold, the dark, and the grinding monotony of endless winter nights. And in a strange way, that makes it more interesting. Because this is how Vikings actually lived. Not in the brief, violent moments of glory that made it into the sagas, but in the long, quiet stretches between, in the darkness, in the cold, in the waiting. Let's start with the most obvious problem. The darkness. Not metaphorical darkness. Not the absence of knowledge or hope, though winter sometimes brought. That too. Literal, physical darkness. The sun disappearing for months, leaving the world shrouded in a twilight that never quite brightened into day. In southern Scandinavia, in what's now Denmark, and the southern parts of Sweden and Norway, winter daylight shrank to just 6 or 7 hours. The sun would rise late, around 9 or 10 in the morning, crawl weakly across the southern horizon, and set again by mid-afternoon. The light that did exist was pale, thin, barely enough to cast shadows. It felt less like daytime and more like an extended dusk, a world perpetually on the edge of night. But in the far north, in the regions above the Arctic Circle, where some Norse communities settled, the situation was far more extreme. The sun didn't just set early, it stopped rising at all. For weeks, sometimes months, the polar night descended. Total darkness, broken only by the stars, the moon when it appeared, and the occasional shimmering curtain of the northern lights dancing across the sky. In green and violet waves. Imagine that. Weeks without seeing the sun, waking in darkness, eating in darkness, working, if you could call it that, in darkness, going to sleep in darkness. Day after day, the same endless night, with no clear way to mark time beyond counting sleeps and meals. It was disorienting, psychologically brutal, and it drove some people mad. Seasonal affective disorder wasn't diagnosed until the 20th century, but Vikings absolutely experienced it. The winter darkness brought lethargy, depression, irritability, and a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the absence of light. Even in regions where the sun did technically rise, the shortness of the day created its own problems. There simply weren't enough daylight hours to accomplish everything that needed doing. Outdoor work had to be compressed into the brief window when you could see what you were doing: feeding animals, fetching water, chopping firewood, repairing fences or buildings, hunting or checking traps. All of it had to happen during those few precious hours of weak winter light. And if the weather was bad, if snow was falling or fog had rolled in, visibility dropped even further. So Vikings adapted. They became creatures of firelight and lamplight, learning to function in near total darkness for half the year. But firelight and lamplight were poor substitutes for the sun, and they came with their own complications, which we'll get to shortly. The darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a constant, oppressive presence that shaped everything about winter life. The darkness affected sleep patterns too. Modern humans live by clocks, by schedules dictated by work and school and social obligations. Vikings didn't have that. They lived by light. When the sun was up, you worked. When it was dark, you rested. But in winter, when darkness stretched for 18 hours or more, sleep became less structured, more fluid. People slept in shifts, woke in the middle of the night, dozed during the day, and generally existed in a state of perpetual semi-restfulness that was never quite satisfying. There's evidence from medieval texts and archaeological remains that suggests a two-sleep pattern was common during winter months. People would go to bed shortly after sunset, sleep for 4 or 5 hours, wake for a few hours in the middle of the night, and then sleep again until morning. During that wakeful period in the dead of night, they might tend the fire, check on livestock, talk quietly with family members, or just lie there in the darkness, thinking, worrying, waiting for sleep to return. This pattern wasn't unique to Vikings. It appears to have been widespread across medieval Europe and possibly much of the pre-industrial world. But for Vikings, with their extended periods of darkness and long confinement indoors, it became a defining feature of winter existence. The night was so long that even sleep couldn't fill it entirely. The darkness also created dangers. Moving around at night was risky. You could trip over objects left in the wrong place, stumble into furniture, or worse, step outside and become disoriented in a snowstorm. unable to find your way back. Stories from Viking Age Iceland and Norway tell of people who left their homes in winter storms, became lost just yards from their doors, and froze to death before finding shelter. The darkness and the weather combined to create a deadly trap. So Vikings learned to navigate by feel and memory. They knew the layout of their homes intimately. They could move through the longhouse in complete darkness, avoiding obstacles, finding what they needed by touch. They developed a kind of spatial awareness that modern people, who can flip a light switch whenever darkness falls, never need to cultivate. And they stayed close to home. Venturing far from the hearth in winter darkness was foolish, potentially fatal, but perhaps the worst part of the darkness was psychological. Humans need light. We evolved under the sun. Our bodies, our brains, our entire biological systems are calibrated to cycles of light and dark. When those cycles are disrupted, when darkness becomes overwhelming and unending, it affects mood, energy, even the ability to think clearly. Vikings didn't understand the biochemistry of seasonal depression, didn't know about melatonin or serotonin or vitamin D deficiencies, but they lived with the consequences. Winter was a time of low energy, of shortened tempers, of irritability that could flare into violence in the cramped, dark confines of the longhouse. The sagas mention feuds that began over trivial slights during winter months, disputes that escalated because people were tired, frustrated, and desperate for any stimulus to break the monotony. The darkness made everything harder. It made people harder, and there was no escaping it. The only solution was to endure, to accept that for half the year the world was dark, and you simply had to live in that darkness until the light returned. Vikings marked the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, as a turning point, a moment of hope. After the solstice, the days began to lengthen again, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but growing. The sun was coming back. Spring was still months away, but the worst of the darkness had passed. That psychological shift, that knowledge that the days were getting longer even if winter was far from over, helped people endure. But until the solstice arrived, until the light began its slow return, Vikings lived in a world of shadows, firelight and long dark nights that tested their resilience in ways no battle ever could. If the darkness was oppressive, the cold was deadly. Scandinavia in winter wasn't just chilly or uncomfortable. It was brutal, bone-deep cold that could kill you if you weren't prepared. Temperatures regularly dropped well below freezing, often plummeting to -20. -30 degrees Celsius in the far north, -4, -22 Fahrenheit. Wind howled across the landscape, cutting through clothing, scouring exposed skin, making even brief exposure dangerous. Vikings didn't have modern insulation, central heating, or thermal clothing. They had wool, leather, fur, and fire. That's it. And while they became incredibly skilled at using those resources, the cold remained a constant, exhausting battle that lasted from October to April and sometimes beyond. The longhouse was the primary defense against winter. These structures, which could be anywhere from 50 to over 100 feet long, were built specifically to house extended families, livestock, and essential supplies under one roof. The design was practical, prioritizing heat retention and communal living over comfort or privacy. Stone foundations supported walls made of timber, often with the gaps filled with a mixture of clay, moss, and animal dung to block drafts. The roof was thatched with straw or turf, layered thick to provide insulation against snow and rain. Inside, the longhouse was divided into sections. The central area contained the hearth, the fire that was the literal heart of the home. Around it, families slept, cooked, worked, and lived. At one end, livestock, cows, goats, sheep, horses were brought inside for the winter. Their body heat contributed to warming the structure, and having them closed meant you could feed them without venturing into the deadly cold outside. It also meant the longhouse smelled terrible, a thick, cloying mix of smoke, unwashed humans, animal manure, fermenting food, and damp wool. But smell was a small price to pay for survival. The fire was everything. Keeping it burning was not optional. If the fire went out in the middle of a winter night, the temperature inside the longhouse would drop within hours to near freezing. Reigniting it, especially without matches or lighters, was difficult, time-consuming, and sometimes impossible if your tinder had gotten damp. So the fire was tended constantly, day and night, Someone always had responsibility for watching it, adding wood, adjusting the logs to maintain a steady burn. Letting the fire die was a failure with potentially lethal consequences. But fire brought its own problems, smoke primarily. Longhouses had a hole in the roof to allow smoke to escape, but it was never quite adequate. Smoke filled the interior, hanging in thick layers that stung eyes, irritated throats, and coated everything in a fine layer of soot. Vikings spent winter months essentially living inside a slow-burning barbecue pit, breathing smoke with every breath. Lung disease was common, respiratory infections were constant. The combination of cold air outside and smoke-filled air inside created a perpetual cough that became the soundtrack of winter, and the fire's heat didn't distribute evenly. If you sat close to the hearth, you roasted on one side and froze on the other. If you moved away from the fire, you shivered. There was no comfortable middle ground. The temperature gradient inside a longhouse was extreme. Near the fire, almost too hot. 10 feet away, cold enough to see your breath. At night, when the fire burned lower to conserve fuel, the cold crept in from all sides, seeping through the walls, rising up from the earth floor, settling like a heavy blanket over everyone huddled under furs and woolen cloaks. Sleeping arrangements reflected this reality. Families didn't sleep in separate rooms or even separate beds. They slept communally on raised platforms built along the walls, piled together under shared furs and blankets. Body heat was pooled, shared, conserved. Parents, children, grandparents, sometimes even extended family or household servants, all sleeping side by side, pressed close for warmth. Privacy was non-existent. Personal space was a luxury no one could afford. The platforms themselves were simple. Wooden frames covered with straw or dried grass, then topped with animal hides and woolen blankets. Comfortable, not particularly, but warmer than sleeping on the cold earth floor. Furs were prized possessions, especially bear skins, seal skins, and reindeer hides, which provided excellent insulation. Families with wealth might have multiple layers of furs. Poorer households made do with worn, patched woolen blankets and whatever scraps they could accumulate. Even with all these precautions, winter nights were cold. People woke shivering, breath fogging in the frigid air. The fire would have burned low overnight. Someone, usually the first person awake, would need to stoke it, add fresh wood, coax it back to life. That person's hands would be numb, fingers stiff and clumsy, making even simple tasks difficult. And until the fire blazed again, everyone suffered in the cold, reluctant to leave the warmth of their shared bedding. Clothing was the second line of defense against the cold. Vikings layered extensively. An undergarment of linen or thin wool came first, worn directly against the skin. Over that, a thicker woolen tunic or dress. Over that, another layer, perhaps a heavier wool tunic or a cloak. Over that, potentially a fur-lined outer garment for venturing outside. Hands were protected with mittens, usually made from wool or fur. Feet were wrapped in wool socks and stuffed into leather boots, sometimes with the boots lined with fur or straw for extra insulation. But even bundled in layers, the cold penetrated. Wool was effective when dry, but it absorbed moisture easily. Sweat, snow, condensation from breath, all of it dampened the wool, reducing its insulating properties and making you colder. And washing clothes in winter was nearly impossible. You couldn't dry them, so people wore the same garments for weeks or months, and those garments became stiff with dirt, sweat, and smoke residue. Frostbite was common. Fingers, toes, ears, nose, all were vulnerable. Exposure to severe cold for even a few minutes could cause tissue damage. Vikings learned to recognize the signs, the numbness, the white or grayish skin, the hardening of the affected area. Treatment options were limited. Gradual rewarming was the best approach, but severe frostbite often resulted in permanent damage, lost fingers or toes, disfigurement, chronic pain. Hypothermia was an even greater threat. If your core body temperature dropped too low, you'd become confused, sluggish, unable to think clearly or help yourself. People suffering from severe hypothermia often made irrational decisions, removing clothing, wandering away from shelter, actions that accelerated their death. The sagas contain references to people found frozen in the snow, victims of winter's ruthless grip. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Their bodies couldn't regulate temperature as effectively as healthy adults. Infant mortality spiked in winter. Older people, especially those already weakened by age or illness, often didn't survive the season. Winter was a natural culling, harsh and unforgiving. Water, essential for life, became a challenge in winter. Wells froze, rivers and streams iced over. Collecting water meant breaking through ice, hauling heavy buckets back to the longhouse, and storing it indoors where it wouldn't freeze again. Melting snow was an alternative, but it required fuel to heat, and fuel, firewood, was a finite resource that had to be carefully rationed. Bathing, already infrequent by modern standards, became almost non-existent in winter. The effort required to heat enough water for washing, the risk of getting soaking wet in freezing temperatures, and the lack of a warm place to dry off made bathing impractical and dangerous. So people didn't bathe. They endured the grime, the itching, the discomfort. Lice were universal, thriving in the warm, unwashed scalps and clothing. Everyone had them. Delousing became a communal activity, families picking through each other's hair by the firelight, crushing the parasites between fingernails. The cold also affected food. In some ways, winter was nature's refrigerator. Meat could be stored outside, frozen solid, and it would keep for months. Fish could be dried or frozen and remain edible. But inside the longhouse, where it was warmer, food spoilage remained a problem. Anything stored there had to be carefully monitored. Grain had to be kept dry to prevent mold. Fermented foods had to be checked to make sure they hadn't gone bad. The balance was delicate, and mistakes could be deadly. Vikings adapted to the cold with remarkable ingenuity. They learned to read the weather, to predict storms by watching the sky, the wind, the behavior of animals. They knew when it was safe to venture out, and when staying inside was the only option. They developed a culture of preparation, spending the warmer months stockpiling firewood, preserving food, repairing buildings, and making clothing, all in anticipation of the coming winter. But no amount of preparation could eliminate the cold entirely. It was always there, seeping in, testing your defenses, finding weaknesses. The cold was patient. It waited for mistakes, for moments of carelessness, for the fire to burn too low, for someone to get wet and not dry off quickly enough. And when it found those moments, it struck without mercy. The cold shaped Viking psychology as much as the darkness did. It taught caution, patience, and respect for nature's power. It taught communal interdependence, the understanding that survival required cooperation and shared resources. And it taught endurance, the ability to suffer discomfort, pain, and hardship without breaking, without giving up. Winter was a test, annual and inevitable, and every spring, when the ice began to melt and the days grew warmer, Vikings emerged from their longhouses thinner, paler, exhausted, but alive. They had passed the test again, and they would face it again the next year, and every year after, until they died or moved somewhere warmer. The romantic image of Vikings as fierce warriors sailing boldly into battle doesn't leave much room for the reality that much of their life was about food. Specifically, about not running out of food during the months when nothing grew and nothing could be hunted or gathered. Winter survival was fundamentally a problem of calories. You needed enough food stored to sustain your household from October to April, roughly 6 months. For a family of 6 or 8 people plus livestock, that meant storing hundreds, potentially thousands of pounds of food. And you couldn't just pile it all in a corner and hope for the best. Different foods required different storage methods. Some needed to be dried, some needed to be salted, some needed to be fermented or smoked. Getting it wrong meant spoilage, mold, rot, and potentially starvation before winter ended. Let's start with grain. Barley, rye, oats. These were the foundation of the Viking diet, the staples that kept people alive when everything else ran out. After harvest, grain had to be threshed to separate the edible kernels from the chaff, then winnowed to remove debris, then dried thoroughly to prevent mold. Any moisture left in stored grain would cause it to rot within weeks, destroying entire harvests. Once dried, grain was stored in sealed containers, wooden barrels, clay pots, leather sacks, anything that could keep out moisture and pests. Mice, rats, and insects were constant threats, A single mouse colony could devastate a household's grain supply in a matter of weeks, eating through months of food and leaving droppings that contaminated what they didn't consume. Grain was ground into flour as needed using hand-operated quern stones, heavy circular stones that were laboriously turned to crush the kernels. Grinding enough flour for daily bread was time-consuming, exhausting work usually assigned to women or older children. The flour was then mixed with water and baked into flatbreads, the most basic and essential food of winter. But bread alone wasn't enough. Humans need protein, fats, vitamins. Vikings supplemented grain with preserved meat, fish, dairy products, and whatever else they could store. Meat preservation began immediately after slaughter. In late autumn, before winter set in, animals were butchered. Not all of them you needed breeding stock for next year, but enough to provide meat through the cold months. The meat was cut into strips and hung to dry in the cold, dry air. Drying removed moisture, making the meat shelf-stable and resistant to bacterial growth. The result was hard, chewy, and required soaking or boiling before eating, but it lasted. Salting was another method. Salt, a valuable commodity often obtained through trade, was rubbed into meat to draw out moisture and inhibit spoilage. Salted meat could last months if stored properly, though it became extremely salty and required soaking before consumption to be palatable. Smoking combined drying with the preservative properties of smoke. Meat was hung above fires, absorbing the smoke and drying slowly over days or weeks. Smoked meat had a distinctive flavor and kept well, though it too became hard and required preparation before eating. Fish, abundant during warmer months, was preserved in similar ways. Cod, herring, and other species were gutted, cleaned, and hung to dry until they became as hard as wooden planks. Stockfish, dried cod, was a staple that could be stored for years. It was light, didn't spoil, and could be reconstituted by soaking in water, then boiled or fried. It wasn't delicious, but it was reliable protein. Dairy products were crucial. Cows, goats, and sheep continued producing milk through part of the winter if they were well fed and kept warm. Fresh milk didn't last, but it could be transformed into products that did. Butter was churned and then salted or stored in bogs, where the cold, acidic environment preserved it for months. Cheese was made by curdling milk and pressing out the whey, creating a dense, hard cheese that aged well and provided concentrated calories and fat. Skyr, a fermented dairy product similar to yogurt, was another staple. It kept for weeks and provided protein and probiotics that helped with digestion. The fermentation process was simple, but required careful management to prevent the milk from spoiling instead of fermenting. Vegetables and fruits presented their own challenges. Most didn't store well without processing. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, onions could be kept in cold storage pits, dug into the earth below the frost line. The constant cool temperature prevented freezing while slowing rot. But even so, they wouldn't last the entire winter. Apples could be dried or stored in cool, dark places. Berries were dried into concentrated, shriveled versions of themselves that retained much of their sweetness and could be added to porridge or eaten as rare treats. Cabbage could be fermented into something resembling sauerkraut, extending its edible life. Nuts, hazelnuts primarily, were gathered in autumn and stored. They were calorie-dense, required no processing, and kept well if kept dry. They were valuable winter snacks, providing fat and protein when other sources were unavailable. Everything was rationed. Even wealthy households couldn't afford to eat freely all winter. Daily allotments were calculated based on how many mouths needed feeding and how much food was stored. Every member of the household received their portion, measured carefully to ensure supplies lasted until spring. Waste was unthinkable. Nothing was discarded if it could be eaten, no matter how unappetizing. Food wasn't just fuel, it was security, wealth, survival. A household with well-stocked storage could endure the winter comfortably. One that had miscalculated, that had a poor harvest, or lost supplies to spoilage or pests, faced hunger, desperation, and potential starvation. Winter hunger was a real and terrifying prospect. As supplies dwindled, rations were cut, People ate less, grew thinner, weaker. Children's growth stunted. The elderly and sick were especially vulnerable, sometimes quietly prioritizing food for younger, healthier family members who had better chances of survival. In the worst winters, when harvests failed or storage was inadequate, entire communities faced famine. Families slaughtered livestock they had hoped to keep for breeding. They scraped the bottom of barrels for the last grains. They boiled bones repeatedly to extract every bit of marrow and flavor. They ate foods normally reserved for animal feed, lichens, tree bark, anything that could fill a stomach and provide even minimal nutrition. The sagas contain oblique references to famine winters, though they tend to focus on heroic responses rather than the grinding misery of starvation. Archaeological evidence is more direct. Skeletal remains from Viking Age burials sometimes show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, vitamin deficiencies. Winter hunger left its mark on bones, teeth, and bodies. But for most winters in most households, the food lasted. It was boring, repetitive, and monotonous. Yes, you ate the same things over and over. Porridge made from barley, dried fish boiled until soft, hard bread, cheese, occasionally a bit of preserved meat. Almost nothing fresh, no greens, no variety, just the same heavy, filling foods day after day, week after week, month after month. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was a risk, though Vikings didn't understand the biochemistry. Some protection came from fermented foods, which retained trace amounts of vitamins, and from occasional access to stored root vegetables early in winter. But by late winter, when supplies were lowest and spring still felt impossibly far away, the monotony and nutritional deficiencies wore people down. The return of spring wasn't just a relief, because it was warmer and brighter. It meant fresh food, wild greens could be foraged, fish could be caught fresh, animals could be hunted. The first spring vegetables could be harvested from early gardens. After months of preserved, dried, salted, and smoked food, something fresh and green felt like a miracle. Food dominated winter in ways modern people struggle to understand. In our world, food is abundant, varied, and available year-round. Supermarkets stock produce from around the globe regardless of season. Refrigeration and transportation have eliminated the tyranny of seasons. But Vikings lived in a world where food availability dictated everything. When you could travel, when you could work, even whether you would survive until spring, all depended on food. Storage, preservation, and rationing weren't optional skills, they were survival. With travel impossible and outdoor work limited by cold and darkness, Vikings spent the winter months engaged in activities that might charitably be called productive, though really, much of it was just finding ways to fill the endless hours. Sitting idle wasn't an option, not because Vikings had some cultural aversion to rest, but because winter brought a crushing boredom that could drive people mad if they didn't keep themselves occupied. The days blurred together, indistinguishable and monotonous. So people worked, not out of necessity, but out of desperation for something, anything to do. Textile production consumed a massive amount of time, particularly for women. Wool needed to be processed from raw fleece into yarn, and then that yarn needed to be woven into cloth. Every step was time-consuming and tedious. First, the fleece had to be cleaned, washed to remove dirt, grease, and debris. Then it was combed or carded to align the fibers. Then it was spun into yarn using a drop spindle, a simple tool consisting of a weighted stick that twisted as it fell, drawing out and twisting the fibers into thread. Spinning was endless. You could spin for hours every day, all winter, and still not have enough yarn to meet the household's needs. Viking families needed vast quantities of cloth. Clothing wore out constantly and needed replacing. Sails for ships required enormous amounts of fabric, sometimes hundreds of square meters for a single sail. Blankets, bags, all needed cloth. So women spun constantly, their hands moving automatically, fingers skilled from years of practice. Once spun, yarn was woven on vertical looms into cloth. This too was slow work. The loom had to be threaded carefully, then the weaver worked the shuttle back and forth, slowly building up from fabric row by row. Mistakes meant unraveling sections and starting over. Finished cloth still needed processing. It was fulled, soaked, and beaten to thicken and strengthen it, then sometimes dyed using plant-based dyes or minerals. The entire process, from raw wool to finished cloth, could take weeks or months, and it was never finished. As soon as one project was done, another began. Winter was textile season, the time when households built up reserves of cloth to last through the coming year. Men also had indoor work. Tools and weapons needed maintenance and repair. Axes, knives, and swords required sharpening, a task done with whetstones, carefully honing the blade to keep it effective. Wooden tool handles cracked or split and needed replacing. Leather straps and harnesses wore out and had to be stitched and patched. Woodworking filled many winter hours. Men carved bowls, spoons, and other household items from wood. Some carved decorative elements for furniture or buildings, intricate patterns that demonstrated skill and provided a sense of accomplishment. Carving was meditative, a way to focus the mind and pass time while producing something useful or beautiful. Rope making was another task. Fibers from plants or animal hair were twisted into cords and ropes, essential for everything from tying down cargo on ships to securing animals or repairing buildings. The work was repetitive and hard on the hands, but necessary. Bone and antler were carved into tools, needles, combs, and decorative objects. The material was hard and required patience to shape, but it produced durable items that could be traded or used within the household. Essentially, Vikings performed the slow, detailed work that couldn't be done during the busy summer months when farming, fishing, trading, and raiding consumed all available time. Winter was when you caught up on everything you'd been putting off. It wasn't exciting work, it was maintenance, the unglamorous but essential labor that kept the household functioning. And it was social. Work happened communally, often around the central hearth where the light was best and the warmth greatest. People sat together, working side by side, talking, gossiping, arguing, telling stories. The work itself might have been monotonous, but it created structure, gave the day purpose, and provided opportunities for social interaction that made the long confinement bearable. Children were taught these skills during winter. Young girls learned to spin and weave from their mothers and grandmothers. Young boys learned carving, woodworking, and tool maintenance from their fathers. Winter was apprenticeship season when knowledge was passed down through demonstration and practice. The long, forced confinement indoors created opportunities for learning that simply didn't exist during the frantic activity of summer. Still, no amount of productive work could eliminate the fundamental boredom of winter. There were only so many hours you could spend spinning wool or sharpening axes before your mind wandered, before frustration set in, before the walls of the longhouse started to feel like a prison. Which is where storytelling came in, the essential art that made winter not just survivable, but occasionally even enjoyable. If there's one thing Vikings are famous for besides raiding, it's storytelling. The sagas, the Eddas, the skaldic poetry, all of it emerged from a culture that valued narrative and oral tradition above almost everything else. And much of that storytelling happened during the long winter nights when there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. Storytelling wasn't casual entertainment. It was art, history, religion, and education all rolled into one. Professional poets, called skalds, held honored positions in Viking society. They memorized vast amounts of poetry, genealogies, myths, and legends, and recited them at feasts, gatherings, and during the long winter evenings. Their words kept history alive, transmitted cultural values, entertained audiences, and sometimes, depending on the skill of the skald, changed the course of events. The stories Vikings told covered every imaginable subject: myths about gods and giants, tales of legendary heroes, their victories, their deaths, their flaws, genealogies tracing families back through generations, historical accounts of raids and battles, ghost stories and tales of monsters, even comedies and satires poking fun at rivals or mocking human foolishness. The repertoire was vast, constantly evolving as new events became stories and old stories were retold with new details. The structure of the longhouse itself created a natural theatre. Everyone gathered around the central hearth at night, sitting or lying on benches and sleeping platforms, faces illuminated by firelight. The skald stood or sat in a position of prominence, speaking into the attentive silence. The fire crackled, shadows danced on the walls, and the skald's voice filled the space, weaving words into images, creating entire worlds from nothing but memory and skill. Skaldic poetry was complex, using elaborate metaphors called kennings and intricate rhyme schemes. A sword might be called a wound hoe. The sea might be called the whale road. These weren't just poetic flourishes. They were a kind of code, a demonstration of the skald's learning and cleverness. Understanding and appreciating skaldic poetry required education and attention. It was high art for an audience that valued intellectual sophistication as much as physical courage. But not all storytelling was formal or elevated. Ordinary people told stories too. Parents told their children fairy tales and cautionary legends. Friends shared gossip and jokes. Older members of the community recounted their own experiences, adventures from their youth, stories of raids they'd been on, or places they'd seen. Everyone had stories, and winter gave them time to tell them. Storytelling served practical purposes beyond entertainment. It preserved history in a culture that, for much of the Viking Age, didn't write things down. The sagas we have today were eventually recorded on parchment centuries after the events they describe, but for generations they existed only in memory, passed orally from one teller to the next. Accuracy was prized, but so was drama. Details were adjusted, embellished, shaped to make the story better, more memorable, more meaningful. Stories also reinforced cultural values. Heroes in the sagas embodied the traits Vikings admired: courage, loyalty, cleverness, honor, and the willingness to face death without fear. Villains displayed cowardice, betrayal, greed, or cruelty. Listening to these stories repeatedly from childhood taught people what their culture expected of them, how to behave, what to strive for, what to avoid. And stories made sense of the world. The myths explain natural phenomena. Why does the sun cross the sky? A goddess drives her chariot. Why does thunder rumble? Thor is fighting giants. Why do winters come? Because Baldur died and the world mourned. These weren't scientific explanations, but they provided meaning and structure, helping people understand their place in a vast and often hostile universe. Winter storytelling created continuity across generations. Grandparents told stories to grandchildren, linking the distant past to the present, connecting individual lives to something larger and more enduring. You weren't just you. You were part of a lineage, part of a people, part of a story that stretched back to the age of heroes and would continue long after you were gone. The long winter nights also allowed for extended sagas, stories too long to tell in a single evening. A skilled skald might stretch a saga over several nights, leaving the audience in suspense, eager to hear what happened next. It was serialized entertainment, Viking style, and it gave people something to anticipate, something to break the monotony of identical days. But storytelling wasn't just for entertainment or education. It was also a form of power. Skalds could shape reputations with their words. A hero praised in verse gained fame and status. An enemy mocked in verse suffered humiliation. Kings and jarls employed skalds specifically to compose praise poetry that glorified their deeds and ensured their names would be remembered. Conversely, skalds could compose insult poetry, and that was so damaging it could legally justify violence in response. Stories were weapons, tools, currency. They mattered in a way modern people, living in a world saturated with written words and digital media, struggle to fully appreciate. In Viking culture, being forgotten was a kind of death. Being remembered in story was a form of immortality. So the stories were guarded, cultivated, passed down carefully, and told over and over during those long winter nights when the darkness pressed close and the fire burned low. And when the stories ended, when the skald's voice fell silent and people drifted toward sleep, the longhouse settled into quiet. But the stories remained, echoing in minds, shaping dreams, connecting people to their past and future. Winter might have been dark and cold and boring, but as long as there were stories, there was meaning. There was purpose. There was life beyond mere survival. Living in a longhouse during winter meant giving up any concept of privacy. Modern people are accustomed to private bedrooms, personal space, and the ability to retreat from others when they need solitude. Vikings had none of that. Families lived communally, sharing a single large room, sleeping side by side, eating together, working together, arguing together, and enduring each other's presence without reprieve. A typical longhouse might house 10 to 20 people, sometimes more. Extended families often lived together. Grandparents, parents, children, unmarried siblings, sometimes even household servants or thralls, all under one roof, all sharing the same space, all breathing the same smoky air and listening to each other's snores. The layout didn't allow for separation. The central hearth dominated the space. Around it, platforms built along the walls served as seats during the day and beds at night. Everyone could see everyone else. Conversations weren't private. Arguments were public. Even sleeping arrangements offered no seclusion. You lay down next to family members, sometimes literally touching them for warmth, listening to their breathing, their coughing, their dreams. This lack of privacy created both intimacy and tension. On one hand, families were incredibly close, bonded by constant proximity and shared hardship. Children grew up knowing their relatives deeply, understanding their moods, their habits, their histories. The enforced togetherness created a strong sense of family identity and mutual support. On the other hand, it was suffocating. Imagine spending 6 months trapped inside one room with your entire family. No escape, no breaks, no privacy for anything. Bathing, when it happened, was in view of others. Bathroom needs required stepping outside into freezing cold or using a chamber pot in full awareness that everyone could hear and smell. Personal conflicts had no cooling off period. If you argued with someone, you couldn't retreat to separate rooms. You had to sit there stewing, within arm's reach of the person who infuriated you. Winter cabin fever was inevitable. The prolonged confinement, the repetitive routine, the lack of stimulation, and the inability to escape grating personalities created psychological pressure that sometimes exploded. The sagas are filled with stories of feuds that began during winter, disputes over trivial matters that escalated because people couldn't walk away, couldn't diffuse tension through distance. Tensions often centered on the usual suspects: interpersonal conflicts, resentments festering over perceived slights or unfair treatment, disputes over work, who was doing their share and who was slacking, arguments about food, whether rations were being distributed fairly, conflicts over noise, someone snoring too loudly or talking too much, or playing rough with children when others wanted quiet. The close quarters also meant everyone knew everyone's business. Secrets were nearly impossible to keep. If someone was sick, everyone knew. If a couple was arguing, everyone heard. If someone was unhappy or struggling, it was visible. This transparency could be supportive, allowing community members to help each other, but it could also be oppressive, eliminating personal boundaries and forcing people to live under constant observation. Sexual privacy was particularly complicated. Married couples shared sleeping platforms with other family members. Finding moments of intimacy required discretion, creativity, and often waiting until everyone else was asleep and hoping they stayed that way. It's not something the sagas discuss explicitly, but the realities of communal living made modesty and privacy luxuries few could afford. The livestock made everything worse. Cows, goats, sheep, sometimes pigs or horses shared the longhouse during winter. They were kept at one end, but walls within the longhouse were rare and usually partial. The animals' sounds, their smells, their movements all permeated the space. You learned to sleep through the bleating, the lowing, the shifting hooves. You learned to ignore the constant smell of manure, wet fur, and ammonia from urine. You had no choice. Children added another layer of chaos. Winter confinement was hardest on them. Young children couldn't go outside to play. They couldn't run, couldn't explore, couldn't burn off energy. They were trapped inside, bored, restless, and often sick. Respiratory infections spread quickly in the close quarters. Colds, coughs, fevers passed from child to child, then to adults, cycling through the household repeatedly over the winter months. Parents tried to keep children occupied with chores, with lessons, with stories. But children are children. They got loud, they fought, they whined, they demanded attention. And there was nowhere to send them, no playroom or yard where they could be separate. They were underfoot constantly, adding noise and chaos to an already stressful environment. Adults coped in various ways. Some withdrew emotionally, becoming quiet and subdued, turning inward to avoid conflict. Others became irritable, snapping over small annoyances, venting frustrations they couldn't otherwise express. Still others threw themselves into work, keeping hands busy to keep minds occupied. finding solace in routine and productivity. Alcohol helped, though it also complicated matters. Vikings brewed ale and mead, and winter was a time when drinking was common. Alcohol eased tension, made the long evenings more bearable, provided warmth and mild euphoria, but it also lowered inhibitions, making arguments more likely and more heated. Drunken disputes could turn violent, especially in close quarters where everyone was armed. A knife was never far from hand, whether for cutting food, carving wood, or defending oneself. Violence within the household was probably more common than the sagas acknowledge. The sources tend to focus on dramatic conflicts, feuds between families, battles, and raids. But the mundane violence of winter, a husband striking a wife, a parent beating a child, siblings fighting, thralls being abused, this happened too, driven by the stress of confinement and the absence of external outlets for frustration. Still, most households managed. Social norms and expectations helped regulate behavior. There were unwritten rules about conduct, about respecting the space even when physical separation was impossible, about managing conflicts before they escalated, about finding ways to coexist even when you'd rather be anywhere else. Humor was crucial. Vikings valued wit and wordplay, and jokes diffused tension. Being able to laugh at absurdity, at discomfort, at yourself made the confinement bearable. The ability to mock your circumstances without letting them crush your spirit was a survival skill as important as any practical knowledge. Community obligations also helped. People understood they depended on each other. If the household fell apart, if conflicts destroyed cooperation, everyone suffered. So most people, most of the time, made an effort to get along. They swallowed complaints. They compromised. They tolerated behaviors they found annoying because the alternative, isolation or banishment, was worse than confinement. And when spring finally came, when the ice melted and the days lengthened and people could finally leave the longhouse, the relief was overwhelming. Families scattered. People found space, solitude, privacy. They could breathe. The pressure valve released, and life resumed its normal patterns. But the memory of winter remained, a reminder that coexistence required patience, tolerance, and a willingness to endure discomfort for the greater good. Winter didn't just test physical endurance, it tested relationships, communities, the entire social fabric. And every spring, when Vikings emerged from their longhouses, they had proven once again that they could survive not just the cold and the darkness, but each other. For all the talk of warriors and raiders, much of Viking society's actual survival depended on the people who did the grinding, unglamorous work that kept households functioning. And in winter, when men couldn't raid or trade or sail, those traditional gender roles shifted slightly, but the burdens remained heavily gendered, with women bearing the brunt of maintaining daily life during the long confinement. Women's work in winter was relentless. Cooking, cleaning, textile production, childcare, tending the sick, managing food stores, feeding livestock when men were unavailable, the list went on. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and largely invisible. It didn't make it into the sagas. No skald composed praise poetry about spinning wool or nursing a sick child through a winter fever. But without that work, everyone died. Cooking in a longhouse was labor-intensive and complicated. The hearth fire served multiple purposes. It provided heat, light, and was the only heat source for cooking. A large iron cauldron hung over the fire, and much of winter cooking involved boiling. Porridge, stews, soups, all were prepared in that single vessel, simmering for hours. The cook, almost always a woman, had to manage the fire carefully, keeping it hot enough to cook, but not so hot it burned the food or wasted precious fuel. Bread baking happened less frequently, perhaps weekly rather than daily, because it required a significant fire and a flat stone or iron griddle placed near the coals. Flatbread was cooked quickly, but preparing enough for a large household took hours, and the grinding of grain into flour was itself a major task done by hand with quernstones. A physically demanding process that left arms and shoulders aching. Water management fell largely to women and children. Someone had to fetch water, break through ice if necessary, haul the heavy containers back to the longhouse, and ration it carefully. In winter, when wells froze and streams iced over, accessing water was difficult and dangerous, and water was needed constantly for cooking, drinking, washing cooking vessels, cleaning wounds, preparing hides, and occasionally washing bodies. Textile work, as mentioned earlier, consumed vast amounts of time, and it was almost exclusively women's work. Spinning could be done while supervising children or sitting with others, making it a background task that filled idle moments. But weaving required focus and uninterrupted time. The rhythm of the loom, the steady back and forth of the shuttle, created a meditative state, but it was also isolating, requiring concentration that limited conversation. Childcare naturally fell primarily to mothers, though older daughters often helped. Winter brought sickness, and sick children required constant attention. Fevers had to be monitored, coughs needed soothing, with whatever herbal remedies the household had. Injuries, burns from the fire, cuts from knives had to be treated, and children needed feeding, cleaning, comforting, entertaining, and disciplining, all day, every day, without pause. Elder care also became women's responsibility. Elderly family members who could no longer contribute physically still needed feeding, cleaning, and companionship. In a culture that revered age and wisdom, caring for elders was a duty, not a burden in the modern sense, but it still required time and energy. Men's winter work was important, certainly. Tool maintenance, woodworking, animal slaughter and butchering when necessary, and heavy outdoor work, like chopping firewood or clearing snow from roofs. But much of men's winter could be spent in relatively leisurely pursuits, sitting by the fire, telling stories, playing board games, drinking with neighbors. Men had more freedom to be idle, to socialize, to rest. Women didn't. This isn't to say men didn't work or contribute. Many did, significantly. But the division of labor in winter, as in other seasons, placed a disproportionate burden on women. The work they did was essential, continuous, and largely thankless. It made survival possible, but received little recognition or status. Women also managed household resources. They decided how to allocate food rations, which stored goods to use and when, and how to stretch supplies to last until spring. It was a form of economic management that required planning, judgment, and constant vigilance. Miscalculations could mean hunger or worse. Social mediation often fell to women as well. In the close quarters of the longhouse, conflicts arose constantly. Women, particularly the household matriarch, played roles in diffusing tensions, mediating disputes, and maintaining harmony. It was emotional labor, invisible but crucial, that prevented minor disagreements from escalating into violent feuds. Women's status in Viking society was complex. They had more legal rights than women in many contemporary cultures. They could own property, inherit wealth, divorce husbands, and manage households independently. Some women held significant power, particularly wealthy widows who controlled family resources. And in the winter household, the senior woman often had practical authority over daily operations, making decisions that affected everyone's survival. But power and labor weren't the same thing. Having authority didn't reduce the work. If anything, it increased responsibility. The woman who managed the household was accountable for its success. If food ran out, if children sickened, if textile production fell behind, she bore the blame, fair or not. The psychological toll of winter fell heavily on women. Men could look forward to spring, to resuming raids and trades, to adventure and travel. Women looked forward to spring as well, but often what it meant for them was different work. Farming, dairying, food preservation, all added to the already heavy burden of childcare and household management. For many Viking women, there was no season of rest, no break from labor, and yet women endured. They adapted. They found moments of joy, of connection, of satisfaction in work done well. They taught their daughters the skills they would need to survive and manage their own households. They supported each other, forming networks of female solidarity that provided emotional sustenance in the harsh conditions of winter life. Winter highlighted the gender dynamics of Viking society. It showed that for all the focus on male warriors and explorers, the foundation of Viking life rested on women's labor, women's endurance, and women's quiet, unglamorous work that made everything else possible. One aspect of Viking winter often overlooked is how they marked time, how they maintained structure and meaning in months when days blurred together into indistinguishable darkness. Without clocks, without calendars in the modern sense, how did Vikings keep track of time during the endless winter? The answer involved a combination of celestial observation, practical markers, and cultural rituals that divided the year into meaningful segments. The Viking calendar wasn't based on arbitrary divisions, but on natural cycles, agricultural seasons, and astronomical events that could be observed and predicted. The winter solstice, midwinter, was the most important temporal marker. It occurred around December 21st, the shortest day of the year, when darkness reached its maximum and then began to recede. Vikings didn't calculate the solstice with scientific precision, but they observed it through careful attention to the sun's position on the horizon and the length of daylight. Midwinter was celebrated with Yule, a festival that predated Christianity in Scandinavia and continued in modified form long after conversion. Yule lasted multiple days, sometimes as long as 12, and involved feasting, drinking, sacrifices to the gods, and rituals intended to ensure the sun's return and the fertility of the coming year. The Yule feast was the social highlight of winter. Households that could afford it slaughtered animals specifically for the celebration, brewing special ale or mead. Neighbors gathered. Stories were told late into the night. Gifts were exchanged. For a brief period, the grimness of winter was pushed back by firelight, food, drink, and community. But Yule wasn't just celebration. It was also a marker, a way of dividing winter into before and after. Before Yule, you were descending into darkness. After Yule, you were climbing back toward light, even though the coldest and hardest months still lay ahead. That psychological shift mattered enormously. Vikings also marked time by counting nights rather than days. This linguistic quirk survives in English words like fortnight, meaning 14 nights. Counting nights made sense in a culture where darkness was more prominent than light, especially in winter. You measured time by how many sleeps, how many periods of darkness, not by how many periods of daylight. Certain practical markers helped structure time as well. The breeding cycles of livestock, the first signs of pregnancy in sheep or goats indicated how far into winter you were. The behavior of wild animals, migrations, hibernation provided clues. Even the stars, though often obscured by clouds, moved predictably across the sky, and skilled observers used them to track the passage of weeks. Lunar cycles offered another way to mark time. The phases of the moon were visible, weather permitting, and provided a natural calendar. A lunar month was roughly 29 or 30 days, close enough to track with reasonable accuracy. By observing the moon, Vikings could estimate how long until spring, how long supplies needed to last, how long until the ice would break, and travel became possible again. But beyond these practical methods, time in winter felt different. It moved slowly. Without the variation of activities and experiences that mark summer days, winter days became monotonous. One merged into the next without distinction. People lost track. Someone might ask, how many days until the solstice? And the answer would be uncertain, approximate, based more on feeling than calculation. This temporal disorientation could be psychologically destabilizing. Humans need structure, markers, ways to measure progress. When time becomes a featureless expanse, when nothing changes and every day feels identical, it affects mood, motivation, and mental health. The Midwinter Festival helped by providing a fixed point, something to anticipate and remember, breaking the monotony into manageable chunks. Religious observances also structured time. Even before Christianity, Vikings practiced rituals tied to seasonal cycles. Offerings to gods for fertility, protection, and prosperity occurred at specific times. These weren't arbitrary, they were tied to practical concerns. You made offerings for a successful harvest before planting. You made offerings for protection before sailing. You made offerings at midwinter for the sun's return. After Christianization, which occurred gradually across Scandinavia from roughly the 9th to 12th centuries, the church calendar imposed new temporal structures. Christian feast days, saints' days, Advent, Lent, Easter, these became ways to mark time. They overlaid existing practices, sometimes replacing them, sometimes blending with them, creating a hybrid calendar that mixed Christian and pagan elements. But in the Viking Age, before widespread conversion, time was less rigidly structured. It was fluid, approximate, based on observation and tradition rather than precise measurement. And that suited the Viking lifestyle, which was agricultural and seasonal rather than industrial and clock-driven. Winter time was waiting time. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't skip ahead. You simply had to endure each day as it came, marking progress where you could, finding meaning in small rituals and observances, and trusting that eventually, inevitably, the light would return, the ice would melt, and life would resume. Winter also had a spiritual dimension that's easy to overlook in modern secular contexts. For Vikings, the world was alive with spirits, gods, and unseen forces. Winter wasn't just a meteorological phenomenon. It was a time when the boundaries between the human world and the supernatural thinned, when the dead walked, when spirits roamed, and when the gods' favor or displeasure determined survival. The long darkness made people uneasy. Darkness was associated with danger, with creatures that shunned the light, with the unknown. Trolls, draugr, undead, and other malevolent beings were believed to be more active in winter, taking advantage of the darkness to move unseen. The isolation of farmsteads made people vulnerable. If something went wrong, if a creature attacked, or a person fell ill, help was distant and difficult to reach. Protective rituals were common, households carved, runes on doorposts or roof beams, symbols intended to ward off evil spirits. Certain objects were believed to have protective power. Iron was especially potent, considered anathema to supernatural creatures. Hanging an iron horseshoe or placing iron tools near the door could keep unwanted spirits out. Offerings were made throughout winter, not grand public sacrifices, but small private rituals. A bit of food or drink might be poured onto the ground, or left on a high shelf for the house spirits, the tomten or nisse, believed to protect the household if properly honored. Neglecting these spirits risked their anger, which might manifest as broken tools, sick livestock, or other misfortunes. The dead were especially present in winter. Viking burials often included grave goods, items the deceased would need in the afterlife, but the dead weren't entirely gone. They lingered, sometimes benevolently, sometimes not. Ancestors were honored, their memory kept alive through stories, but there were also restless dead, those who died badly, violently, or dishonorably, and refused to stay in their graves. Ghost stories and tales of hauntings were common winter entertainment, though they were more than just scary stories. They reinforced cultural values and explained misfortune. If livestock died mysteriously, perhaps a draugr had cursed them. If someone sickened without obvious cause, perhaps a malevolent spirit was responsible. These explanations provided meaning and control in a world where randomness could be terrifying. Dreams were taken seriously, especially in winter when people slept longer and more fitfully. Dreams were believed to be messages, visions, warnings from gods or spirits. A vivid dream might be discussed by the entire household, analyzed for omens or guidance. Prophetic dreams foretelling the future were particularly valued and feared. A dream of death, battle, or disaster was a warning that required action, whether through ritual, offering, or simply heightened vigilance. The gods themselves were thought to be more active in winter, or at least more necessary. Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and death, was associated with winter and the wild hunt, a spectral procession of the dead that rode through winter skies. Hearing the hunt was a bad omen, seeing it was worse. The wise stayed indoors and avoided looking up when strange sounds echoed through the night. Thor, god of thunder and protector of humanity, was invoked for protection against the dangers of winter. Frey and Freya, deities associated with fertility and prosperity, were honored in the hopes that spring would return and the land would be productive again. The gods weren't distant or abstract. They were part of daily life, invoked, honored, and sometimes feared. Christianity, when it arrived, didn't entirely displace these beliefs. Instead, it layered over them. The Christian God, the saints, and the angels took on roles similar to the old gods. Protective. Prayers replaced protective runes, though sometimes both were used together. Christmas replaced Yule, but many of the old practices, feasting, drinking, community gathering, continued under Christian names. Winter's spiritual dimension provided comfort and explanation. It offered ways to understand suffering, to make sense of loss, and to find hope in the darkest months. Whether through pagan rituals or Christian prayers, Vikings sought connection to something beyond themselves, something that could offer protection, guidance, and the promise that spring would return. As winter finally began its slow retreat, as the days lengthened imperceptibly and the worst of the cold eased, Vikings turned their attention toward preparation. Spring didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in, tentative and fragile. Ice thinned, snow softened, streams began to trickle, and Vikings, weary from months of confinement, started preparing for the season of activity ahead. The transition from winter to spring was gradual and required careful judgment. Leave the longhouse too early, venture out before conditions were safe, and you risked getting caught in late-season storms that could be as deadly as midwinter weather. But wait too long and you'd fall behind on essential tasks: planting, repairing, preparing ships, putting the household at a disadvantage for the coming year. Ship maintenance was a priority for communities that relied on maritime travel and trade. Ships had been pulled ashore in autumn, covered, and left to endure winter weather. Now they needed inspection. Hulls were checked for damage, planks were replaced if necessary, caulking was applied to seal gaps, rigging was repaired or replaced. Sails, if stored properly, were inspected for mold or damage and mended. This was communal work. Ships were expensive, often owned collectively or by wealthy individuals who employed crews. Preparing them for spring voyages required coordination and labor from multiple households. It was also social, a chance to reconnect with neighbors after months of isolation, to share news, gossip, and plans for the coming season. Agricultural preparation began as soon as the ground thawed enough to work. Fields had to be plowed, a task requiring oxen or horses and significant physical effort. Plowing turned the soil, breaking up compacted earth and preparing it for planting. Seeds saved from the previous harvest were inspected, sorted, and prepared for sowing. Timing was crucial. Plant too early and a late frost could kill seedlings. Plant too late and crops wouldn't mature before autumn. Vikings relied on accumulated knowledge passed down through generations to judge when conditions were right. They watched for signs: the behavior of birds returning from migration, the budding of certain trees, the feel and smell of the soil. These weren't precise science, but they were effective. Fishing resumed in earnest as waters became accessible. Fish spawned in spring, migrating upriver or into shallow coastal areas, creating opportunities for abundant catches. Fresh fish, after months of dried and preserved food, was a delicacy, a sign that the worst was over, that variety and abundance were returning. Hunting also picked up. Animals emerged from hibernation or migration, and their hides, now in prime condition, were valuable. Spring hunts provided fresh meat and materials for clothing and trade. Repairs to buildings and infrastructure consumed significant effort. Roofs damaged by winter storms needed patching. Fences broken by snow or ice needed rebuilding. Tools worn down by winter use needed replacing. Everything that had deteriorated over the long months of cold had to be fixed before the busy summer season began. Trade resumed as travel became possible. Merchants who had been confined locally all winter could now venture out, visiting markets, exchanging goods, gathering news from distant regions. The first travelers arriving from elsewhere were eagerly questioned for information. What had happened in other communities? Who had died? Who had been born? Had there been feuds or alliances? Trade wasn't just economic, it was informational, reconnecting isolated communities into broader networks. Psychologically, spring brought relief that's hard to overstate. The darkness lifted, the cold eased, the confinement ended. People could move freely again, work outside, see neighbors without trekking through snow. Children could play outdoors. Adults could escape the longhouse's oppressive closeness. The world expanded again after months of shrinking. But spring also brought renewed responsibilities and pressures. The easy, if boring, rhythm of winter gave way to frantic activity. There was planting to do, repairs to make, ships to prepare, animals to tend, fishing and hunting to pursue. The luxury of sitting by the fire telling stories was over. Summer was coming, brief and precious, and every day mattered. For some, usually young men, spring meant preparing for raids. Viking raids typically occurred in late spring through early autumn, when seas were navigable and weather was favorable. The long months of winter had been spent maintaining weapons, planning routes, and discussing targets. Now it was time to act. Raiding was controversial even within Viking society. It was dangerous, morally ambiguous, and often condemned by those who preferred trade and farming. But for many, especially younger sons who wouldn't inherit land, raiding offered opportunities for wealth and status unattainable otherwise. So they prepared, sharpening swords, checking armor, and saying farewells to families they might not see again. For those staying behind, spring meant a different kind of preparation, ensuring the household could function without the men who left, managing farms, protecting property, and handling any crises that arose. Women, children, elders, and those unable or unwilling to raid took on these responsibilities, keeping communities running while others sought fortune elsewhere. Spring was hope made tangible. After months of endurance of merely surviving, people could finally thrive again. They could work with purpose, build, grow, create. The long winter had tested them, worn them down, and proven their resilience once more. And as the world thawed and life returned, Vikings moved forward, carrying the lessons and memories of winter, already aware that in just a few months, the cycle would begin again. The winter's grip finally loosened. Snow melted into muddy streams. Ice broke apart with sharp cracks that echoed across valleys. Buds appeared on trees. Birds returned, filling the air with songs unheard for half a year. The world, frozen and silent for so long, awakened. Vikings emerged from their longhouses, blinking in the strengthening light, thinner, paler, exhausted, but alive. They had endured. They had survived another winter, another test of their endurance, their ingenuity, their ability to outlast the cold and the darkness and the grinding monotony of confinement. The relief was profound. Doors could be left open. Fresh air circulated through the longhouse, carrying away months of accumulated smoke, odors, and staleness. People washed properly for the first time in months, scrubbing away grime and lice in streams still shockingly cold but no longer frozen. They changed into lighter clothing, shedding the heavy, filthy layers they'd lived in all winter. Livestock were driven out to pasture, bellowing and leaping with something resembling joy, stretching legs that had been cramped for months. The longhouse, relieved of their presence, could be cleaned, though the smell never entirely left. Floors were swept, old straw was removed, fresh rushes were laid down. The space, which had felt like a prison, became a home again. Children ran wild, released from months of confinement. They explored, played, shouted, laughed, worked off energy that had been bottled up with nowhere to go. Parents, while exasperated by the chaos, couldn't entirely suppress their own relief. The worst was over, but the memory of winter lingered. It always did. Vikings knew that in just a few short months, autumn would arrive, bringing the first frosts, the shortening days, the reminder that winter always returned. So they worked through spring and summer with urgency, knowing the clock was ticking. Crops had to be planted, tended, harvested. Repairs had to be made, supplies had to be gathered. Firewood had to be cut and stacked. Food had to be preserved. Everything Vikings did during the warm months was done in the shadow of winter. They never forgot. They couldn't afford to. The raids, the voyages, the adventures that made them famous, those were possible only because they had survived again and again. The long, dark months when survival meant sitting still and enduring. Winter shaped Viking culture in profound ways. It taught patience, resilience, and the value of community. It fostered a culture of storytelling, of preserving knowledge and history through oral tradition. It created tight family bonds, forged through months of forced proximity and mutual dependence, and it instilled a deep respect for preparation, for planning ahead, for understanding that survival wasn't guaranteed, that it had to be earned through hard work and careful management of resources. The Vikings who raided England, who explored Iceland and Greenland, who reached North America, who traded from Baghdad to Dublin, those same people spent half their lives confined in dark, smoky longhouses, spinning wool, sharpening tools, telling stories, and waiting for spring. The winter months weren't glamorous, they weren't exciting, they didn't make it into epic poems or dramatic sagas, but they were real. They were the foundation upon which everything else rested. And in a strange way, that makes the Viking achievement even more impressive. They didn't just survive the battles and the voyages. They survived the boredom, the cold, the darkness, the confinement, the endless grinding monotony of winter, year after year after year, and they did it without modern technology, without easy answers, without any guarantee that spring would find them alive. So when we think of Vikings, when we imagine long ships and axes and raids, we should also remember this: the long winter nights, the smoky longhouses, the dark, cold months when nothing happened and survival was the only victory. Because that's where Vikings truly lived. Not in the brief, violent moments that made them legendary, but in the slow, patient endurance of seasons that tested them in ways no enemy ever could. Winter was the true Viking trial, and every spring when they emerged, thinner and weary but unbroken, they had won again.